Okay, let's have a little bit on language, form and structure. Just to remind you about when we talk about form and structure, the form is the kind of the type of poem, if you like. In this case, it's a sonnet. It's a sonnet form. We have lots of different forms of poetry. The sonnet is one of the most common, one of the most typical, and it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, form of poetry. Certainly one of the oldest forms of poetry. The sonnet is 14 lines. You can see here it has 3 stanzas of 4 and a stanza of 2, and that makes 14. There's usually a particular rhyme scheme. This uses a particular type of rhyme that we'll talk about in a moment, and it tends to use traditionally a particular meter or rhythm to the line. So we get a 14-line poem, and you usually get a rhyming couplet at the end, and you get that here. Here's how they rated him when they looked back. Sometimes he did this, sometimes he did that. And the rhyme is, although it's actually called a half rhyme throughout most of this poem, by half rhyme I mean that it partly rhymes, but it doesn't wholly rhyme. If you look drive and side, it's the I sound which rhymes, but the v and the d clearly don't rhyme, so it's a half rhyme. And night and lied is the same. The I sound is repeated, but not the final consonant sound. Pretty well all the way through. Wage saved, made face, nurse church, worse, purse. Worse and purse is a full rhyme. Back and that. So apart from the full rhyme of worse and purse, everything else is a half rhyme, but it still rhymes at the end of each line. Why does Armitage do it? Again, remember, please don't just say in an exam that lines 1 and 2 rhyme and 3 and 4 rhyme, because as I've said in previous podcasts, a trained monkey would be able to work that one out. You need to ask why he does it. Well, a sonnet is usually in praise of someone or in praise of nature, and I do think there is an element of praise in this poem. There's an element of highlighting this man's good points, and I think because of the form of the poem and the very traditional form of the poem, when we get the more shocking things the man does, I think they're even more shocking. So this very formal, tight structure, and when it snowed and snow covered the drive, he took a spade and tossed it to one side. In a previous podcast I've talked about iambic pentameter. He took a stage and tossed it to one side. And that kind of type of poetry that we would expect in a love poem. And yet, and once for laughing punched her in the face. It really shocks us because it's the kind of formal style of poem that we wouldn't expect a line about punching a wife in the face. It kind of jars. And I think Simon Armitage is brilliant when it comes to this sort of this way in which he kind of pulls us up. We've seen it. We saw it in Hitcher. We saw it in Gooseberry Season. Where if you look back at Gooseberry Season, I'm just going to be flicking back. And that's where does the hand become the wrist, where does the neck become the shoulder, the watershed then the weight. There's that real kind of lyrical, poetic centre, and then he drowns the man in the bath. And it's quite shocking because you've got that poetic image contrasted with something really quite brutal and quite ugly and quite disgusting, quite psychopathic. And the crooklock, when he's just after the guy's talking about the truth is blowing in the wind or round the next bend, and then he beats him to death with a crooklock. He contrasts the ordinary and the everyday with the shocking, and he does it time and time again in his poetry, and I think the sonnet form kind of adds to that shockingness. So what we have is the language contrasting with the form and structure, the structure of the poem with the very tight rhyme scheme and the tight stanzas and the meter, and the language at times being very beautiful, and when it snowed and snow covered the drive is a very beautiful opening to the poem, contrasted with that rather brutal, rather ugly thing, and then the whole thing being undermined at the end by this and that all those brutal, ugly things just become this and that when the man dies. Very, very clever poem, and a very effective use of language contrasting with form and structure.